In the shadowed corridors of ancient Egyptian tombs, beneath layers of gold and stone and sacred spell, lies a truth so unsettling it has survived millennia only in silence. Hidden behind the splendor of sarcophagi, the grandeur of hieroglyphic hymns, and the shimmering allure of Tutankhamun's burial mask is the story of a dynasty slowly devouring itself from the inside. Not from war or famine, but from a decision both divine and damning, to preserve purity by sealing their bloodlines in an eternal genetic prison. For over 3,000 years, Egypt's royal families practiced incest not as taboo, but as sacrament, a holy communion between siblings, cousins, and even uncles and nieces, all in the name of godhood. And yet, behind every divine union lay a dying child. Behind every sacred vow a future cut short. What was born of religious reverence became a biological reckoning so profound that its scars are written in the bones of mummified kings and queens. Kings who limped through life on crutches, their spines twisted, their skulls deformed, their bodies failing before manhood. The boy king Tutankhamun, lionized in textbooks, mythologized in museums, was no radiant god in flesh. He was a fragile, broken teenager whose body bore the weight of generations of collapsed DNA. His famous collection of 130 walking sticks wasn't ceremonial regalia. They were survival tools, necessary for a king whose foot was clubbed, whose femur was fractured, whose immune system was too compromised to withstand even a minor infection. His early death at 19 was not a tragedy of fate. It was the cost of a dynasty's obsession with preserving what it believed was sacred. The pharaohs believed their blood was not merely noble, but divine, an inheritance not from human ancestors, but from the gods themselves. And to dilute such blood with outsiders was to offend the very heavens. So they created a sacred mirror of the gods' own incestuous unions. Just as Osiris married his sister Isis, so too would the living embodiment of Horus marry his sister on earth. A celestial imitation, born of ritual, reinforced by myth. The result was a self-inflicted trap from which they could not escape, a dynasty held hostage by its own sacred biology. Over 30 dynasties would follow this path, forging a legacy gilded in gold but cracked beneath the surface. With each generation, the genetic load worsened. Mutations accumulated. Children were born with cleft palates, scoliosis, epilepsy, malformed skulls, and weakened immune systems. Death came young. Fertility rates dropped. Many royal infants never drew breath. Those who survived were often frail, cognitively impaired, or beset by chronic disease. And yet, the rituals continued. The priests anointed, the gods were thanked. The cycle repeated. Because to break it, to marry outside, would be to sever the pharaoh's claim to the heavens, and in ancient Egypt, there was no greater blasphemy. Modern science, with all its cold precision, has finally given voice to what the ancients tried so desperately to hide. The secrets embalmed within the linen-wrapped dead have been unwrapped by CT scans and DNA sequencing. Tutankhamun's genome, mapped for the first time in 2010, revealed the brutal truth. His parents were brother and sister. He suffered from choler disease, bone necrosis, malaria, and a congenital cleft foot. His hips were deformed. His spine was curved. His immune system was crippled. He could not walk unaided. And yet, he was God on earth. That was the paradox. The divine, in Egypt, was suffering. To be chosen by the gods was to be marked, often with pain, deformity, and early death. What the ancients interpreted as sacred suffering, we now understand as biological collapse. Their mythos had made them prisoners of their own sacred story. They could not escape what the gods had commanded, and so they chose to suffer gloriously, painting over the truth with gold leaf and lapis lazuli. The very same mummification process designed to protect the pharaoh's essence in the afterlife has become, ironically, the instrument of their modern exposure, for the linen and resin preserved not just skin and hair, but DNA. And that DNA tells a tale the hieroglyphs dare not utter. A tale of desperate ritual, blind obedience, and a biological gamble that ended in tragedy. In laboratory terms, the level of inbreeding within some Egyptian dynasties mirrors that found in lab mice, animals deliberately bred for genetic uniformity. But humans are not mice, and sacred blood, for all its ceremony, cannot defy the laws of genetics. Nature does not bow to myth. The creation myths that once inspired these unions now read like psychological blueprints for generational disaster. In the beginning, the earth god Geb marries his sister Nut, the sky. Their children, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, follow the same celestial pattern. Osiris marries Isis, Set marries Nephthys, and so the divine blueprint was passed down, not just as mythology, but as law. The gods had shown the way, the pharaohs merely followed, but no divine plan can protect flesh and bone from the realities of inheritance. And slowly, silently, the dynasty weakened. There are no epic battlefields in this story, no enemy armies storming the gates. The fall came from within, from shared chromosomes, from love declared sacred but rendered lethal. The grandeur of Egypt, its towering obelisks, its eternal pyramids, its temples carved in stone, all stood atop a foundation of biological fragility. Its creatine fractal, its tumted sonnets, its eternal stress, its liturgal pyramids. Its temples carved in stone, all stood atop a foundation of biological fragility. The very blood that claimed descent from gods became the poison that hollowed out an empire. Even now, the legacy of royal inbreeding haunts the historical record. The long gaps in succession, the sudden deaths, the mysterious disappearances, all signs of a dynasty gasping for survival, and still the tombs tell only part of the story. The bodies of royal children, too malformed or too sick to rule, were often buried quietly, anonymously. Their names erased, their memories swallowed by desert sands. They were not failures. They were sacrifices, offerings to a myth that demanded blood purity above all. Their pain was not recorded. Their suffering was seen as divine affliction, a mark of the chosen. And so the cycle endured, long after the warning signs were visible. What remains today are echoes in bone and gene and crumbling stone. The pharaohs believed they were building eternity, but they built a trap, one lined in gold, but sealed with silence, and it is only now, with the lens of modern science and the unflinching eye of history, that we can finally see the truth they buried beneath layers of myth. Not all gods bless, some curse, and not all dynasties fall by the sword. Some, like Egypt's most glorious, fall by their own blood. The desert does not forget. Beneath the burning sands and forgotten stone, a deeper truth waits, one not carved into temple walls or etched into the Book of the Dead. It whispers through bone dust and broken amulets, revealing that the royal tragedy of Egypt was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a much older and more widespread darkness. Humanity's dangerous dance with sacred blood, power, and death. Across time and continents, the pursuit of divine lineage has left similar scars. From the Andes to the Alps, from forgotten jungle empires to frozen Nordic thrones, royal bloodlines became obsessions, fetishes of power and purity, where incest was not only tolerated but institutionalized. And always, the price was steep. Consider the Spanish Habsburgs. Their jawlines alone tell a story no monument can contain. Centuries after Egypt's last pharaoh was laid to rest, Europe's most powerful royal house became a living case study in genetic disaster. With jaws too malformed for speech and minds too fragile for rule, their empire slowly bled power as their bodies betrayed them. At the apex of this unraveling stood Charles II of Spain. El Hechizado. They called him bewitched, but there was no sorcery behind his suffering. only chromosomes, identical, tangled, and collapsing under the weight of centuries of mantos. Interfamily marriage. By the time Charles was born, his inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. His tongue was so enlarged he could barely speak. He suffered frequent seizures, could not walk unaided, and never sired a child. He was the last of his line, the final Habsburg to rule Spain, and dynasty ended not by war but by its own blood. His autopsy revealed a heart the size of a peppercorn and a single atrophied testicle. His family had married itself into extinction. This was not an accident, it was a belief system, echoed across cultures, that certain families were chosen, set apart by the gods' destiny or divine right, and that their blood must remain pure at all costs. Incest among royalty wasn't just tolerated, it was elevated, justified, made sacred by myth and law. In ancient Hawaii, brother-sister marriage among royalty was known as niupi'ua, holy union designed to produce children of the highest possible rank. In the Inca Empire, divine blood was concentrated through royal sibling marriages, reflecting their belief in descent from the sun god, Inti. Even in the ancient Khmer and Sumerian cultures, sibling unions appeared among ruling elites. Always the same pattern: power, purity, and collapse. This sacred incest did not exist in a vacuum. It fed into deeper systems of divine kingship, of priestly control, of ritualized suffering, and nowhere is this connection more grotesquely illustrated than in the ancient practice of ritual disability, where deformity and pain were seen not as curses, but as proof of chosen status. Across civilizations, disfigurement was imbued with meaning. The Aztecs believed that physical suffering brought individuals closer to the gods. Ritual mutilation was not punishment, but exaltation. Among certain Mayan elites, infants' skulls were deliberately bound to elongate the head, a mark of nobility thought to symbolize higher thought or divine proximity. But in these same cultures, deformity, whether natural or inflicted, was woven into hierarchy and belief. Just as the pharaoh's twisted spine became a symbol of divine suffering, so too did the grotesque become holy in other corners of the world. In medieval Europe, madness and seizure were thought to be messages from God. Joan of Arc's visions were born of a neurological condition or divine voices, depending on which truth you choose to believe. The thin line between sacred and cursed, divine and diseased, was a line humanity crossed often, and with reverence. It wasn't always the rulers who bore this weight. In some cultures, the suffering was exported, placed onto the backs of others, the expendable. The Oracle of Delphia, the Pythia, inhaled toxic gases that likely caused hallucinations and neural damage, yet her words shaped empires. In the dark heart of the Roman Empire, gladiators were bled not just for entertainment, but for medicinal ritual. It was believed that the blood of a dying man, especially a strong, valiant one, contained healing power. Epileptics were known to drink this blood, fresh from the arena sands, as a cure. Behind every empire's glory stood a mountain of human experimentation, rituals masquerading as medicine, doctrine twisted into death. And still the obsession with blood continued, not just bloodline but blood itself. In the Renaissance courts of Europe, the belief in the royal touch emerged. Kings who were thought to cure diseases like scrofula with a mere laying on of hands. These were not symbolic acts. Thousands flocked to be touched by monarchs, desperate for healing from rotting sores and diseased flesh. Kings were believed to carry divine power in their very skin. In France and England, the tradition persisted for centuries. Even in the Enlightenment era, the bodies of monarchs were treated as miraculous instruments, even as their minds collapsed under centuries of inbreeding and political rot. The contradiction never registered. Power was holy, blood was sacred, and death, when it came, was merely a veil to the afterlife, a transition to something more eternal. That's how they justified the madness. That's how they kept the rituals alive. But the truth is colder. These were not gods. These were men and women locked in cages of myth, sentenced to die slowly by the weight of their ancestors' decisions. Their suffering wasn't sanctified. It was systematic. A centuries-long experiment in the consequences of believing too deeply in your own divinity, a belief that power must be kept pure, that pain was a form of elevation, that incest could bring one closer to heaven. But heaven never came. Only silence, only tombs, and eventually, only dust. Even today, echoes of these ancient beliefs remain. We see it in our language, bloodlines, royal families, divine right. We see it in our obsession with ancestry, pedigree, and legacy. We still mythologize lineage. We still crave sacred power. But the bones of kings tell us otherwise. Power has a price, and blood remembers. In the end, all that remains is the body, rotting or mummified, crowned or shackled, worshipped or burned. The illusions fall away and only flesh tells the truth, and when you listen closely to the bones of history, they don't echo with glory, they weep. Beneath the gold leaf and marble monuments, beneath the solemn hymns and divine myths, lies a horror too intimate to be recorded on scroll or stone. The human cost of our obsession with power, legacy, and purity. The fall of Egypt's divine line. The madness of the Habsburgs. The bleeding arenas of Rome. These were not isolated catastrophes. They were chapters in a single global tragedy, the ritualized suffering of the few, exalted in the name of the many. And yet, it wasn't only royalty who bore the wounds. The madness spread downward, like rot in the roots of a sacred tree. In medieval Europe, those without power often became the canvas for society's darkest compulsions, its medical delusions, its religious ecstasies, its need to watch pain and call it holy. Consider the flagellants, roaming bands of religious zealots who, during times of plague and famine, marched through towns whipping their own flesh raw in public displays of penance. Blood sprayed on stone streets as crowds wept or cheered. The suffering was believed to purify. The pain, a sacrifice to God. Disease wasn't a failure of hygiene or science. It was a spiritual consequence, a punishment. Only agony could cleanse, only blood could pay the debt, and so it flowed freely, across cities blackened by plague, through villages ruled by superstition, until suffering itself became a kind of currency, proof of virtue, evidence of holiness. They bled not because it worked, but because they needed it to mean something. In the early modern period, medical practices often straddled the line between cure and cruelty. Bloodletting, for example, became one of the most widespread treatments in history. For over 2,000 years, it was believed that nearly any ailment, from fever to mental illness, could be treated by draining blood from the body. Patients were bled until they fainted, until they died, and all the while the best minds of the time insisted this was mercy. That the pain was not just necessary, it was beneficial. Hospitals became temples of slow suffering. Leeches clung to the sick like living prayers. Barbers doubled as surgeons, and the crimson-striped barber pole, still seen today, was born from the blood-soaked bandages that once hung outside their shops. These were not back-alley butchers. They were society's healers, and they truly believed that salvation lay in the draining of life. But there is a difference between ignorance and obsession, and some treatments went beyond desperation into the realm of the grotesque. In Renaissance France, it was believed that the menstrual blood of virgins cured leprosy. In early England, powdered mummy, literal ground-up remains of Egyptian corpses, was sold as medicine to treat everything from epilepsy to stomach ulcers. The wealthy would consume the flesh of the ancient dead, washed down with wine, convinced they were swallowing vitality, sanctity, something eternal. The irony was suffocating. The very bodies once worshipped as gods in ancient tombs were now digested by nobles in candlelit parlors. Cannibalism disguised as therapy, death marketed as restoration, and all of it sanctioned by the highest authorities of the age. But some rituals didn't even hide their cruelty. In parts of medieval and early modern Europe, cure by execution was not a metaphor. The blood of the freshly killed was believed to be the most potent of all. Executions became public pharmacies. Spectators would rush the scaffold, collecting the warm blood of the condemned in cups, rags, or bare hands, then drink it on the spot. The rationale? That life force, taken at the moment of death, was charged with power, that it could transfer strength, insight, even divine favor. The condemned became vessels, unwilling saints, sacrificed, not just for law but for health. Even their agony was consumed. The deeper one looks into the past, the clearer the pattern becomes. We have always mistaken suffering for sanctity, whether it was the inbred pharaoh or the epileptic oracle, the bleeding peasant or the poisoned king. We have built entire civilizations atop the broken bodies of those we declared chosen. Sometimes that chosen status came with a crown, sometimes with a noose, but the result was the same: myth that demanded blood, and a people willing to spill it. This cult of sacred suffering shaped more than medicine or monarchy. It rewired how societies understood the human body. In parts of medieval Christendom, illness was not something to be cured but endured, proof that one had been selected for divine testing. The more you suffered, the closer you were to Christ. Saints were often those who had been tormented by disease or injury. Saint Lidwina, for example, was canonized not in spite of her grotesque, decades-long illness, but because of it. Her body rotted while she lived. She lost pieces of her spine, her limbs twisted, her skin sloughed off. But she smiled through it all. The Church declared her holy, not because she healed, but because she didn't. She became a symbol of grace through agony. A new standard was born: to suffer without complaint, to accept torment as divine purpose. And still, none of it worked. The plagues came anyway, the kings died anyway, the children with royal blood still perished in the womb, or limped through cursed reigns before collapsing beneath the weight of their own legacy. All the rituals, all the sacrifices, all the borrowed myths and ancestral lies, they changed nothing, because the truth, unspoken yet undeniable, was this: blood does not sanctify, pain does not purify, lineage does not protect. These were illusions, beautiful, deadly illusions passed down through time like sacred heirlooms, each generation clinging tighter than the last. So what remains now, we who look backward through glass and screen, who walk through museums lined with the bones of kings and the tools of their priests? What do we inherit from this history? Not just artifacts, not just names carved in stone, but the remnants of an ancient hunger, a need to believe that power must come from blood, that suffering has meaning, that some bodies are worth more than others, that purity is real, and yet the evidence lies silent in the tombs. Divine blood turned to dust, sacred pain forgotten, entire dynasties erased by the very myths they swore were eternal. And so we return, again, to the quiet dead, preserved in salt and resin, buried beneath symbols of their own undoing. They do not speak, but if they could, they might tell us that they were never gods, only victims of a story too powerful to question, that they were offered up to a dream, one written not in truth but in terror, and that dream, once shattered, leaves only silence, only bone, only the long, aching echo of everything we were willing to destroy in the name of sacred blood.